Hi, and welcome to the Rare Business Podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe, and I'm a consultant, advisor, researcher, and writer on all things related to customer service and customer experience. Through this podcast, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, and leading thinkers about what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees in this fast-moving modern age that we live in. If this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then welcome, and please do dive into the archives at adrianswinscoe.com, as I've now completed over 250 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then thank you for returning, and I'll aim to do a good enough job to keep you coming back week after week. Anyway, that's enough from me right now. Let's get into the interview.
How long did it take you to write the book, by the way?
Whoa. It ended up being, it's very, very difficult combining writing a book with a job. Because although notionally you have the time free, what you really need to write a book is long swathes of uninterrupted time. And I managed to take, I think, 2 months off work where I sort of broke the back of it. The problem was then completing it. And I managed to get a chunk of 7-day periods where there was nothing but book to do. And I suppose it took me over sort of two and a bit years actually doing it. From it first being commissioned. And I must admit, I delayed and busted the deadline several times.
So is it a thing that you'll find yourself, do you think you'll repeat the process, or?
I will. What I will do next time, I will dictate far more. I finally, towards the end, got into voice dictation. And discovered that, the simple problem with writing a book, by the way, is actually, regardless of anything to do with content, is just the physical exertion of having to type 110,000 words.
So I've written 2, and I'm in the process of finalizing my 3rd, and I've gone the opposite way. So rather than I dabbled with the idea of writing another sort of 50, 60, 70, 80,000 kind of word book. And I thought to myself, that would take me towards a theory of everything. And I thought the world doesn't need another theory of everything, so let's not.
Fascinating.
And so what I have done is I've written a much, much shorter book, which is much more design-led. And it's called, you might like this actually, it's called Punk CX. Brilliant. I love it. I've bought it already. Fantastic title. It's very, very interesting, the whole question of customer experience, particularly because as one of the rules I say, I think I've got 11 rules of alchemy in my book. And one of them is the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. Yes, indeed. And so the whole idea of customer experience doesn't really submit to the standard thinking around best practice or, there are elements of CX where you probably want to be highly conformist, but actually there are 2 great ways of welcoming people to a hotel, as I always say. One of them is highly automated and impersonal and streamlined, and the other is actually the opposite. It's highly elaborate and involves large degrees of obsequiousness. But they're both good. It all depends on what your expectation is. Well, exactly. And also, in many ways, recognizing the sort of the time of day, the type of kind of person, and kind of what's the most expedient thing to do. Because actually having all sorts of people fawning over you and being very obsequious, if you've had the journey from hell and you're arriving in the middle of the night,
it's actually extremely annoying.
Yes, it's like
I've always thought,
leave me alone.
I've always thought the Eurostar fails on this, because what you want on your journey to the meeting, which is actually a sandwich which gives you room on your laptop table for a laptop and a bit of paper.
Yeah.
You actually want a sandwich and a very strong coffee on the way out. Yes. And then you want an elaborate banquet with fine wines and Belgian chocolates, to quote Swiss Tony, on the way back. And so I always think the business of trying to actually optimize, the way I do the Eurostar is, anybody going really early in the morning is almost certainly going to a meeting. What everybody wants early in the morning is strong coffee and a bacon roll. Okay, we'll make allowance for different religions, but broadly speaking, that's what you want. There's nothing can improve on that. On the way back, there's something entirely different going on, which is you've been to the meeting, you're generally relaxed.
Yes. you're probably going to read them.
The thing is that they maybe should have they should have sort of a decision tree that they can respond to it. So like, actually go like, good meeting, not as well as it didn't go as well as expected. Like, great meeting, and then you're going to have this elaborate banquet and you're celebrating. And then if it's not as well as you expect, you're like, getting hard liquor.
Yeah, no. Well, you could argue that tequila slammers would work for both, couldn't you?
That is very true.
The tequila slammer is particularly versatile in that if you've had an appalling time or a brilliant time, the tequila slammer is actually entirely appropriate. Yeah.
But then again, it does limit your potential sponsorship opportunities.
But one thing I'd like to say, by the way, is having studied behavioural science, what I think it's done to me and to the team I work with within Ogilvy is we always talk about what you might call discipline neutrality. And one of the things that behavioural science has taught me is rather like, I think if you're a music connoisseur, okay, the very best of any category is great. Yes. And one of the things that music snobs tend to do, which I think is a terrible mistake, is they immediately essentially reject a few genres. The first genre to go if you're a music snob, country and western, heavy metal. Okay.
Right, yes.
And there's probably a death metal would go, gospel would go, by the way. Yeah.
So that's an absolute crime, because if you've never seen real gospel in the flesh and not been moved by it, then you
have a heart of stone.
Exactly.
Yeah. In fact, there's an extraordinary recording which has been filmed, but because Aretha Franklin was very cranky about rights and legal fees, there's a wonderful performance from 1971 where she performs a whole in this church in Los Angeles with the Southern California Community Choir, and in musical terms, it's off the charts. I mean, it's as good as anything anybody's ever produced. Likewise, the best country. Likewise, the best metal.
Yes.
And music snobs tend to actually immediately start by actually trying to rank by genre, whereas the very best of anything is brilliant.
Absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
the very best of anything is brilliant. And one of the great things that behavioral science has taught me is that PR can be genius, CX can be genius, advertising can be genius, direct marketing can be genius. What you might call humble disciplines like application form design can manifest instances of genius. In fact, it can be very, very important in the achievement of anything. You can do the best advertising campaign in the world for American Express, but if the application form is shite, you're wasting 2/3 of the efficacy of the ad campaign.
Absolutely.
One of the things it's done to me is it's made me a kind of yes, how would you describe it? The term, I suppose, would be what do they call it in religion? Not evangelical. No, it's made me one of those people who's very accepting of different faiths, ecumenical.
Right. Okay.
It's made me highly ecumenical in my approach to marketing. It's also changed my mind significantly and it caused me to realize how wrong most marketers are and most people in agencies about the order in which you approach the problem.
Yes. Yeah,
and the crazy thing is,
it becomes like everybody's got their various religions, but very little faith.
Now, my argument is looking at it from being informed by things like the theory of constraints, which is an Eli Goldratt thing, bottleneck theory, and so on. Actually, when you think deeply about it, you have to optimize the process from the end backwards. That the first thing to optimize is the experience, because if the experience is no good, bad advertising is actually damaging, because you're just encouraging lots and lots of people to discover and talk about how shit you are and how disappointing you are compared to expectation.
Exactly.
So the first thing you optimize is the experience, and therefore the propensity to repeat purchase. Then you should optimize conversion, because there's no point in doing good advertising if you lead people to a shop or a choice architecture or an application form or a website which doesn't convert.
Yes. No,
okay. And only then should you work backwards towards advertising, when you've optimized the rest. And yet, because of the sums of money involved, marketing always considered advertising to be the first problem to address.
Yes.
It seems to me fundamentally mistaken.
Yeah. So, Rory, we're supposed to be having a sort of an organised discussion about for the podcast. No, that's fine. That's fine, because actually I sort of expected this, but I just thought we've sort of got done things a bit back to front. So for people that are kind of joining us now and wondering what's going on, this is the Rare Business Podcast. I am with Rory Sutherland. We are going to talk about his new book, but before we get started, because Rory and I have talked before, and we'll just get stuck into things. Rory, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you just give us a bit of a vignette about yourself so people will understand kind of a bit your background and where you're coming from?
So I joined Ogilvy in 1988. I've been there for 30 years. I joined as a graduate trainee and soon afterwards became a copywriter in the direct marketing wing of Ogilvy, as then was. I had huge good fortune, in fact. You might have considered yourself conventionally unlucky to get into direct marketing rather than advertising, because advertising in the late 80s was the more fashionable of the two by a long way. However, I've always regarded it as a moment of extraordinary good fortune, because in the Ogilvy, first of all, David Ogilvy, in fact, recommends that you work in direct marketing first, because you get to learn what works. Mm-hmm. And simply the fast feedback element of direct marketing means that you actually learn faster than you would in advertising.
Yes.
But also I think direct marketing, you learnt faster because it had a kind of vocabulary for describing what people were doing. Mm. But the other element of great fortune was not only being in direct marketing, but was being in what was then Ogilvy and Mather Direct, where you had Drayton Bird, Steve Harrison, a whole host of Andy Greenaway, Andy Firth, a whole host of advertising, subsequently, advertising and marketing greats who you could learn from in one place. Mm. And so the good fortune in terms of who you are surrounded by and who you could learn from was astounding. I mean, it was kind of an epicenter at the time, and actually I think I realized it at the time as well. I realized, gosh, this is really quite an extraordinary place to be. So that was very, very good. And then over time, being in direct marketing, the other reason it was advantageous was that it placed you in the perfect position for, first of all, the changing nature of marketing clients, which were less and less packaged goods and more technological, financial, etc. So, or B2B. So first of all, it gave you grounding in, working with a mobile phone network, say, or a broadband provider, rather than just working with someone selling crisps. Nothing wrong with selling crisps, but the complexities are different. Secondly, it meant you were in pole position when the internet came along, because you kind of understood it better. Whereas people who had a conventional advertising model, it took them longer to get their heads around it.
Sure.
And then thirdly, I think it placed me in a wonderful position for what was the other sort of decisive turning point of my life, which was the discovery of behavioral science and behavioral economics.
Yes. Perfect.
And so one of the decisive moments was, first of all, I was a very, very early internet user, not only because I worked in direct marketing. My brother was an academic. So I first used the internet, astoundingly, in 1987. Wow. And that was because my brother was an astrophysicist, and I blagged his university login. We were at the same university. And I blagged his login and started exploring news groups and alt.rec.pets.cats or whatever it was. Back before there was a web. It also meant for my brother that I discovered the web existed on about day 27.
Yes.
That, in academia, there was this talk about this thing that's come out of CERN, which was Tim Berners-Lee's creation of a web browser. And so I dutifully went on about, day 150 of the web, or day 212 or whatever it was. I logged on to the University of, where was it, Urbana-Champaign in Illinois, and downloaded what was effectively the first browser, which was the forerunner to Netscape. And I've completely forgotten what it was actually called. Astonishing.
Netscape Navigator was...
That was the first browser, was it?
Yeah, I think so. It was Netscape, and I think it was Navigator was the first one, because Mozilla and Firefox is the thing that came out of the Embers, I think.
They came out of the Embers, you're absolutely right. So it must have been something like that. And so I was quite early, actually too early in a weird kind of way, because it meant that you spent the first 3 years, as David Ogilvy once said of his love of direct marketing, like a prophet preaching in the wilderness, because you were talking to people who literally thought either you were bonkers, or that it was just for nerds ordering pizza, or in the words of one advertising person, that it was effectively teletext for the 1990s.
Yeah, I remember kind of like coming at it sort of slightly later. I think it was probably 88, 89 or something when at university, and the university was very excited about the fact that we had these connected Sun sort of workstations sort of thing. So it was a bit like
Spark workstations, were they?
Yeah, they were. Yeah. They were brilliant when they worked, but they were so sensitive. They used to crash a lot of the time. So it's a bit like having access to all this stuff. It never worked. So it's a bit like it's almost a bit like having a DeLorean sports car. So you're like going, it looks great, but it's crap. Yes. It's crap to drive.
I can also remember hysterical moments. Like I can remember making a cup of tea while you downloaded a song. I can also remember I was very friendly with a guy in Ogilvy IT, and 2 laptops had come in. And one of them was designed for a senior manager and had a 28.8 modem.
Right.
And mine had a 14.4. And the guy said, this bastard in senior management isn't going to know the difference. So secretly, I'm giving you the one with a 28.8 modem. And I remember going home and finding a 28.8 kilobits per second modem excitingly fast, because pictures actually downloaded within a tolerable time frame.
Yes.
Now, it occurred to me that I suppose the internet, if you had a 28.8 modem, would be effectively unusable, wouldn't it?
These days it would be, I think it would be, it's almost a bit like it's fascinating. There's an idea around kind of like, you talked about theory of constraints, but almost like how constraints can drive creativity. And in many ways, it's fascinating how bandwidth has gone kind of 2 ways. It's sort of allowed us to be a bit more creative and a bit more visual in things, but actually in many ways it's allowed us to be, it's been made us more lazy because it's easier to do more rather than do less.
Yes, and so what you might call that sort of driving economy, as one person called it, but I can't remember which person it was, might be Buckminster Fuller or someone, but that feeling that you had to accomplish something as elegantly as possible has possibly gone missing with people who can effectively splurge, can effectively waste RAM and bandwidth all over the place.
Yeah,
exactly. Some of that ingenuity of thinking of, how can we streamline this further, probably has become a bit of a dying skill.
I think that's kind of true. I mean, I think it's just because you can, therefore you can like, we should. You're like going, yeah, maybe not. But anyway, here's a thing. It's a shiny gold thing, and it's called a book that you've just written, and it's called Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. And I've gone through this, and I'm thinking, and I was talking to you a little bit before about it, about the writing of it, and it's been a while coming, and it seems it's all about behavioral economics and what we can learn from it, and what you've learned along the way, I guess. But before I tell everybody about what it's all about, you're the author. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and give us an idea of its main thesis, as it were?
I suppose it's a very fractal book. There are lots of footnotes which are examples of my own digressions. It's a very fractal book, and it was once described, which I thought was one of the greatest plugs for it, which is it's a book which is absolutely not about design and all about design at the same time.
Yes.
So it's not ostensibly a book about design thinking, but it is absolutely a book about design thinking. And I deliberately wrote it not for a trade or industry audience.
Right.
Partly out of greed, of course, in that you want to sell as much as you possibly can, but also because of something Jeremy Bullmore once said, which always fascinated me, which is, he said, the best books about advertising aren't about advertising.
Yes.
And the mistake I think that marketers have made in selling the value of marketing is they've always gone in with a marketing message, talking in marketing language designed to appeal to marketers. Now, marketers aren't the target audience here. Marketers already know instinctively and through experience the value of marketing to some degree. Mm-hmm. The really important audience to reach is the audience of people whose minds have been polluted by neoliberal economic theory,
yes,
who instinctively hate marketing and think it's cheating.
Mm-hmm.
And my argument is that actually, if you are a marketer and you've had 30 years experience in marketing, it not only gives you quite a lot of things you have to say about marketing, I think it gives you quite a lot of things to say about wider capitalism, industry, the design of services, the design of government policy, even, which is that the narrative that economics imposes on capitalism is that it's all about efficiency through competition.
Yes.
And my argument is that's actually a relatively small and trivial and unimportant part of the real value of capitalism as distinct from, say, a control economy or something like that. And the real role of both marketing and business in general is that it's experimental. It's a discovery process that essentially there's a way of looking at humankind, which is it's very Austrian school. It's also very, if you're interested in Austrian school economics, Hayek, Schumpeter, etc. Actually,
can I put my hand up here and say I am an economist by background? But I also, in my defense, as I was getting to the end of my training, I became slightly disillusioned with the doubling down on mathematical kind of models and the fact that we can kind of battery farm everybody into an industrial kind of process. And I chose to go and study more the history and the theory of political economy as a way of coloring the background, as it were.
Studying the history of economics is probably much more valuable than studying economics, not least because I would argue that economics, if you plot its path, is an unusual case of a science becoming more wrong over time.
Yes.
It starts with Adam Smith, who's effectively a philosopher and behavioral economist, as well as an economist.
Exactly.
So Adam Smith's other book, obviously everybody knows The Wealth of Nations, but the book on human nature. Sorry,
Theory of Moral Sentiment.
Moral sentiment. I'm getting confused with Hume for a second there.
Yes,
you're absolutely right. His moral sentiments book is very much a book about behavioral economics.
And arguably, I would suggest in his portfolio is probably the more important book.
He thought it was, interestingly. So Smith himself was more proud of moral sentiments than he was of The Wealth of Nations. And interestingly, it's also worth knowing that as economics became more and more mathematicized, the school of thought, most notably the Austrians, who believed that value was a psychological property, not a real-world objective property, became frozen out of mainstream economic discourse simply because you couldn't get a teaching job if you weren't prepared to teach the maths.
Yes.
And the Austrians, on ideological grounds, refused essentially to mathematicize economics to the extent that was then necessary to pass an exam. And so the more interesting school of thinking, it's also worth remembering Thatcher was much more a kind of Hayekian, I think, than she was a sort of Friedmanite. That actually the more interesting school of thinking got frozen out of the discussion. And what you realize actually is that, in fact, if you're a marketer, you realize that Hayek didn't go far enough. Not only is there the problem of information in markets, which is how do you actually, without a price mechanism, direct scarce resources to the point where they're most needed. I would go even further and say that without the price mechanism and experimental markets, you can't even discover what people want in the first place because they don't know.
Well, yeah, because then it's the challenge with economics broadly is the idea about making generalized assumptions. And you're absolutely right. It's like unless you actually kind of like make those explicit, make them clear, and test them in reality, and then actually refine them down to different sort of categories and submarkets, then you don't really understand anything.
No. Conventional economics is not actually an empirical science. As it's essentially a theory in search of a universe.
Yes, indeed.
It's a wonderfully elegant theory, and all they're looking for now is the reality in which it actually proves true, and they've completely failed to find it on Earth. That's certainly true.
I mean, I think what's interesting about it, I have always seen it as being a bit of a toolbox with which to look at things to try and understand how things can like.
Oh no, and it's not. By the way, I mean the fact that incentives matter. We'd be, as marketers, we'd be deranged if we took some ideological stance where we always refuse to reduce the price of something or discount something or reward people for doing something. That would be absolutely batshit crazy. And I'm not suggesting, what I'm suggesting of economics is it's like the tube map. It's a very good map of the tube, but it's not a map of London.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's not geographical, it's utility focused.
And it's only useful if you're getting from one tube station to another tube station. Mm-hmm. The second you want to go to South London, or the second you want to make a journey that, I remember this from absolute reality, being with a bunch of central Londoners from Adland who are in Greenwich. Yes. And we were on some sort of treasure hunt, and our next destination was next to Charing Cross Station. And they all wanted to go back on the DLR and catch the Jubilee line, and then change onto the Bakerloo line.
Yes.
And I said, you're batshit crazy. Look, there's a station here which has 4 direct trains an hour to Charing Cross. Yes. And they almost refused to believe me until I actually took the app out of my pocket. In the end, we arrived, because of my living in Sevenoaks and having superior knowledge of the South East London train network, we arrived in the pub 40 minutes before anybody else.
Even better, because you're just finishing your first drink, they arrive and get another round in.
They got another round in for us, so it was pretty much perfect. We might have had 2 drinks, I think, by the time anybody arrived. But it's exactly that point, which is you can very, very easily get beguiled by the elegance of something, i.e. the tube map. And what you become blind to is the areas where it doesn't cover, or the areas where what it advises is deeply distorted.
Yes.
So the lack of geographical, there's another point, of course, which I think I noticed recently. I keep asking young people, you know, you're always complaining, not unreasonably, about insane London property prices, mm-hmm. but equally you refuse to move to suburbia.
Yes.
So young people, you know, in Ogilvy would rather put a gun to their head rather than move to Bromley or Orpington, okay?
Yes.
And you could actually find affordable and tolerable property, because let's face it, if you think about it, area increases at the square of distance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what they don't realize from looking at the tube is that they think that distance and journey time are proportionate, because, of course, there are no fast tubes. In New York, you get non-stop subway trains, don't you, which only stop at the major stations, mm-hmm. because they've got 4 lines on there. It's cut and cover, so they've got 4 lines. Now, of course, there are trains from Bromley South and Orpington which don't stop between Bromley South and Victoria or Orpington and London Bridge.
Yes.
So actually, you can actually enjoy a shorter commute from living further out. But anybody who's brought up on the tube map finds this concept impossible to grasp.
Well, no, I don't think it's.
Well, of course, you're in Brighton, aren't you? So, of course, you get some pretty good trains from Brighton.
Well, indeed, and that's the thing. But it's like, I guess it's one of those. It's like this. It's a psychological mindset. It's a case of like you have to accept that you're not in London anymore, and there's something there's a belonging that comes from being in London as opposed to being in Bromley or Orpington, and it's all about kind of where they are in their kind of like their
in your life stage. But I think it's Darwinian. I think it's actually to do with mating. That if you live in Bromley, you can't pull. That's my theory.
And
I think it's all a peacock's tail thing, which is, you know, essentially no one's going to come home with you to Bromley, are they?
No. Well, that's
it's probably high. I think it's highly Darwinian.
I think you might
suburbia is where people go when they've spawned. You see,
it's a nesting place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, back to this book thing, because you're, I guess, exploring all of these ideas that you say don't make sense. So with that in mind, this sort of sense sort of thing, in the book, you explore this idea. There's a difference between nonsense and
completely
sense, as it were. Can you explain the difference?
I was very influenced by this. Nassim Taleb, when he wrote the book Anti-Fragile, made the point that the ancient Greeks didn't have a word for blue. And you have a kind of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis going on here, which is that vocabulary limitations limit thinking and limit understanding.
Okay, yeah.
And Nassim coined the word anti-fragile because he had to make the point that there wasn't a word that covered the idea of something which was actually strengthened by being stressed.
Okay, yeah.
So you have robust. Now, a metal thing is robust, but it doesn't become any stronger if you throw it against a wall.
Right.
Whereas a human muscle becomes stronger if you exercise it.
Yes.
And so our entire thinking around what you might call risk and decision-making and everything else was distorted by the absence of this word. Now, if you notice, there is no useful... one of the worst words, of course, in the English language is irrational. Yes. Which may mean simply not in keeping with your pre-existing model of the world. It may not mean wrong. Okay, seemingly irrational things can be extraordinarily potent. In fact, that's where most invention and discovery comes from, which is someone realizing that the dominant assumption in their market or in their market category, one of the dominant assumptions in their market category is actually wrong.
Yes.
Or if not wrong, not exclusively true. So one of the important distinctions I make in markets as distinct from in physics is that the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea.
Can you give me an example?
Coke tastes really good. Red Bull tastes kind of disgusting. Depending on what you're selling, you may need a totally different approach. So if you want people to believe that a product has medicinal value, it has to taste slightly weird.
Right, yes.
If you want to believe that a product is a diet product, it has to taste slightly compromised. You know, frozen yogurt, Diet Coke, by the way, the reason you have Diet Coke and you have Coke Zero is because Diet Coke, unlike Coke Zero, both of them contain 0 calories, Diet Coke has to taste slightly more bitter than ordinary Coke in order for people to believe it's a diet product.
Because like their diet is a
so essentially the human brain has a kind of what you might call a no pain, no gain, effort reward heuristic, whatever you call it, which is a kind of belief that actually if you want to gain something in one domain, you've got to make some sort of sacrifice in another.
Right.
And so...
Is that a conditioned construct, do you think, or is that something that just kind of... there's a natural...
I think there's a natural believability thing, which is that we believe that IKEA is cheap. Let me put it in a very simple way, which is a phrase I've used a lot. There's a big difference between pick your own strawberries and cheap strawberries. Pick your own strawberries say you gain savings in your strawberry consumption through the input of some effort on your own part.
Right.
Cheap strawberries, that's totally believable. Mm-hmm. Because you go, I get it, I'm picking the bastards, therefore I should save some money on the thing. Okay?
Yeah.
Whereas cheap strawberries raise doubts, where you go, well, hold on, if these strawberries were really any good, why is the chap having to sell them so cheaply?
Or I'll buy them, and by the time I've taken them home, they'll be moldy.
They'll be moldy. They'll have gone a bit manky. And so what you need to understand is that there's logic which appeals to a very particular, very conscious and very mouthy part of the human brain. But the human brain does not run on this operating system principally or even very much. It's the operating system we use for arguing, for winning arguments, for preparing PowerPoint presentations, for working in McKinsey, for proposing government policy, in order to win arguments. But there's a distinction between the part of the brain that's evolved to win arguments and the part of the brain that's evolved to win. Yeah, and to win in reality involves a different mental skill set to actually winning in an argument.
So does that mean that we could actually argue that logic for many people is relative, and for some people
it's domain dependent, and it is perfectly possible to be very, very plausible and logical and wrong, and it's perfectly possible to sound utterly illogical and bonkers and actually be proved right.
Yeah, because in the book, you talk about this. There's these main reasons that we've evolved to behave in what you say is seemingly illogical kind of ways.
Yes,
but I was kind of getting at. I was thinking, like, for some people that go, that's absolutely bonkers, but right.
So one of the highest bits of praise for the book is that quite a few evolutionary biologists like it.
Right.
So Robert Trivers is enjoying it at the moment. I consider him the Galileo of 20th century evolutionary biology. I mean, he was the person who, to put it slightly rudely, had Richard Dawkins' ideas first about gene-centered evolution.
Yes.
And his insight was very similar to the insight of Einstein, which was, there's a wonderful phrase by a guy called, I think, Alan Kay, who is actually a web design expert. Mm-hmm. And he's certainly a user interface expert. And his great sentence is, a change in perspective is worth 40 IQ points. Mm. Now, it's perfectly possible that Einstein, in a funny kind of way, wasn't all that bright. I mean, by which I mean, what I'm not suggesting for a second. Okay. No. But what I'm suggesting is there may have been people like von Neumann, etc., who are smarter than him.
Right.
Einstein's chief achievement was to effectively reframe. Everybody looked at time. Someone explained this to me the other day. Everybody looked at time and distance as being constants and speed being a variable. And Einstein, by asking the question, what would it be like to ride on a beam of light? Change the perspective so that actually speed became a constant and time and distance became variables. Mm-hmm. Now, in the same way, I would argue a change in perspective, as Alan Kay says, a change in perspective gives you 40 IQ points. Now, what Trivers did was he actually looked at evolution not at the species level or at the level of the organism, but at the level of the gene. And by doing that, you essentially had this extraordinary breakthrough in progress in thinking in terms of evolutionary thought. Okay. Now, the other person, Matt Ridley, is like the book. He said, as a committed rationalist, I should have hated this book, but in fact, I loved it, which is exactly the response I want, but particularly from someone who's a great evolutionary thinker.
Yes.
And I was influenced in this, by the way, weirdly, and Matt will be really chuffed to hear this, because I was a classicist and because I happened to be taught by a guy who was an expert in Epicureanism, I read a lot of Lucretius. And right. Lucretius was the thinker in the ancient world who got to a lot of this. He was, actually, is that a great thing? I think you might be able to make a case that other than Aesop, maybe Epicurus you'd have to include, etc., and the Stoics. But actually, these people were, in some level, behavioral scientists. Mm-hmm. And so it's really, really interesting. Once you have the fusion with evolutionary thinking, you suddenly realize that there are lots and lots of assumptions about what humans are trying to do, or rather what humans should be trying to do, that are actually fundamentally wrong. Yeah. And what's interesting is that the humans themselves don't understand. So we think we're much more rational than we are, because the part of the brain that does the talking and the arguing and the part that actually has consciousness is disproportionately designed to win arguments, not to make decisions.
Yes.
So the extreme case I'll make, the extreme Hayekian case, is that nearly everybody in the world, now we could ask an interesting question here, by the way, about people with mild Asperger's or autism, which might be an interesting one to ask. Okay, but and this will be a very, very interesting experiment to perform. But one of the things you might notice about people who are on the spectrum is they're often called anoraks.
Yes.
Now, anorak is an extraordinarily practical form of clothing, which is uncool.
Yeah.
So if you only have a kind of functional understanding, but you don't have an understanding of signaling and social psychology, you will wear an anorak. Because, I mean, because what could be more sensible?
Yes.
Okay? An anorak with some waterproof trousers on a rainy day is a brilliantly logical solution to the problem, unless you realize that clothing is not merely about protecting yourself from the elements. Now, what I would say is, it's an interesting question, which is, I think people who are on the Asperger's autism spectrum can make very, very good social scientists, because they've got to work it out for themselves. Mm-hmm. Most of us buy brands, and it'd be very interesting to look to see whether the people on the spectrum were less prone to buying brands and more prone to buying products on what you might call the level of specification alone. In other words, I'm not remotely interested in the name that's on the back of this computer or laptop. I will actually look at clock speed, RAM, etc., and make my decision based on utility per pound.
Yeah, I mean, I think this probably it would be interesting to. You'd have to factor in, I guess, relative. There must be a desire for social inclusion, a relative level across that.
And it may also be that actually most people, one of the things that might make it quite difficult if you're highly, what you might call rationally inclined. Mm-hmm. is that you make decisions from the point of view of a maximizer, not a satisficer, which also makes decision-making more difficult.
Yes.
Because, what is the optimal anorak to buy? How do you make a trade? Those decisions. My brother's an astrophysicist, and whereas I wouldn't put him on the spectrum, what I would say, maybe a little bit, what I would say is that if you put him in IKEA and said, you can't come home until you've chosen a sofa, he'd starve to death there. Okay?
Yes.
Because the rest of us use a whole bunch of heuristics, which are not designed to find the optimal sofa. Okay, they're designed to find a sofa that's a mixture of pretty good on average and low downside risk.
Yeah. And
so we use brands for that purpose because brands require the social intelligence to go, if this person has a lot of reputation at stake, therefore they have a lot to lose from selling a bad product. Therefore, I can be confident that a sofa sold to me by IKEA won't be a total crock of shit.
Yes.
Okay, so, and when we're not trying to make an optimal decision, we're trying to make a non-catastrophic one. And by the way, fashion is more about non-catastrophe. You buy a Ralph Lauren polo shirt because it's not a faux pas. There's no risk of significant crappiness.
Yeah,
in both the social domain and actually in the utilitarian one as well.
So you said
the really interesting. Just to finish the bit with the Hayek thing.
Sure.
The weirdest thing is all of us buy brands without really realizing why we do it, because the part of the brain that wants us to buy the brand isn't connected to the bit that does the rationalization or the talking.
Right.
And so the Hayekian view, I would take, it extends even further to the level of actual purchase and consumption.
Okay. So what I want to do is, that's really interesting. What I want to do is come back and pick up on something that you kind of said earlier, because you talked about, made a reference to a change of perspective could kind of raise your IQ by 40 points, as it were. And that made me think about how this idea that many brands, just people in general are talking about that we are sort of suffer from almost like an empathy deficit in large part, particularly in business and politics, just society in general sometimes. And this idea that I wonder if that's the business case for more empathetic efforts, because actually change your perspective, become more, improve your empathy, look smarter.
The interesting way you'd put it would be, it is very, very easy to design a product which is economically rational, but anthropologically dumb. Now, the biggest case of this I can find is probably the incentive the government uses to encourage pension saving, which is to give you a rebate, effectively to give you a tax rebate, which is paid not to you, but it's paid into the pension. Right?
Yes.
So it's almost unnoticeable. Now,
yes.
All I can say in evidence against this is I have never come across any marketer in the history of the world who has an offer which says, do this now and something great will happen in the year 2035. Okay, sure. I don't know a single marketing proposition that effectively says that. And indeed, even if you did a discount on something where the cashback was deferred by a year, you'd notice a massive fall off in enthusiasm in terms of the efficacy of your discounting.
Yeah,
by delaying the payback.
Yes.
Now, by the way, I don't think that is irrational because, of course, I don't think hyperbolic discounting is irrational, because if I promise to pay you 20 quid now, you're pretty much on the spot to hand over a £20 note. If you promise to pay me £20 tomorrow, the level of uncertainty increases massively because, you could say, I'm terribly sorry, I'm not coming to London tomorrow after all, or, oh, damn, I haven't got any cash on me. Okay. Mm-hmm. The level of wiggle room you have in not fulfilling a promise in terms of the difference between immediately and tomorrow and in 10 years' time is absolutely massive.
Well, they end up with this kind of trust and payoff.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing is the government spends $40 billion a year on these tax rebates. That's a third of the cost of the NHS. I would argue it is spectacularly and mind-numbingly ineffectual, except in making rich people even richer.
Well, yes.
In other words, rich people who are kind of, the kind of person who would benefit from this scheme is someone who works in financial services and who's 4 years away from retirement, who suddenly decides to pump in huge amounts of discretionary income into his pension because he can afford to effectively mop up the government subsidy. Those people do not need help. Okay, I'm a conservative. I'm not some sort of weird socialist guy, right? But I'm saying I'm very middle of the road. If there's one thing the government should not be doing is taking money from the poor and giving it to the rich.
Yes.
Okay, that's what rock musicians are for. The government should not be doing reverse Robin Hood stuff, where effectively it takes money away from the NHS to fund the retirement of rich, financially sophisticated people. This is fucking appalling, okay?
Yeah, well, it's the road to pitchforks.
Yeah, I know. The reason I say I'm a conservative, by the way, is important because it's not just me burbling. It's because sometimes when you criticize something in capitalism, people assume your animus is necessarily a kind of political one.
Sure.
Regardless of your politics, all of us, apart from, Sir Fred Goodwin, in the last 3 years of his working life, all of us should be angry with this government policy, and we're not. Now, I've spoken to random people in marketing, and I've said, if you want a 26-year-old to put £200 into a pension, two things. One, should you allow them to draw the money back again at some level? Mm-hmm. Everybody says yes, because at the age of 25, you don't want to be paying 19.9% APR to a credit card while you have £7,000 in your pension. That would be ridiculous, okay? Sure. So the fact that you should be free to draw down some of your pension earlier than retirement would solve this problem where when you're 25, being 60, 65 effectively seems like another universe. You're a different person, okay? Mm. The second thing I've asked marketing people to debate is I said, which would be more effective at getting the 25-year-old to save? We will give you a complete tax rebate paid into your pension, which, of course, you won't see till you're 65, but it's a huge amount of money we're paying you straight away from the taxpayer, or free iPad.
Right.
And nearly every marketing person I've spoken to, in fact, every marketing person I've spoken to said free iPad would be more effective. Yeah. So the government could effectively give everybody at the age of 25, 26, 27, create a window as well. So you don't get the free iPad if you wait until you're 28. Oh, no, siree. Right? Create that. At the price of a free iPad for every 26-year-old, you could basically have, well, what's that going to cost you? It's going to cost you, how many people are there? I guess there are about 500,000. I guess they're about 500,000, not quite, people in each age cohort. That's going to cost you £500 million a year to do that. Okay. By contrast, it costs 40 billion to provide the tax rebate, which is actually less effective as an incentive.
But then, this is sort of like a recurrent theme that you explore in the book. This idea of almost like effective, seemingly illogical sort of thinking. Because you've actually kind of talked about, because the thing that I struggle with, and you've been quoted before as saying, unfortunately, it is often better to be measurably mediocre than immeasurably brilliant.
Yes, absolutely true.
And this idea, we've got this desire for logic, proof, and data-driven decision-making and stuff. And it's almost a bit like, it feels like we're going, squeezing all of the creativity, the dare to be differentness, as it were, out of the things that we do. Because if we can't prove it, we can't model it, or we can't show it, then it's just like,
it possibly explains the extraordinary value of the entrepreneur. Creative destruction and the Hayekian role played by the entrepreneur, which is the entrepreneur actually has every disadvantage in the world compared to someone working in a large organization, sure, which is well-funded, well-capitalized, and has existing income streams, databases, everything else you'd want to innovate. Okay. And yet the one thing the entrepreneur has is he's not required to justify his idea, one hopes, to a large committee.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Because I guess kind of a large organization is all about mitigating risk and kind of maintaining its own sort of existence.
And it should be, by the way, just to be clear about that, it should be 80% about that.
Yes.
But it should be 20% about actually looking for ways to cannibalize itself.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And so it's almost a bit like the entrepreneur is like almost a 20-80, and then the established organization is like an 80-20 on the flip.
Yeah. And by the way, rightly so. You know, if you're in charge of Procter & Gamble's brand Tide, which I think has 70% of the US detergent market, don't fuck it up, right? You know, I mean, seriously, you know, that is your brief, you know. They are doing actually very good advertising, but nonetheless, you've got to be pretty cautious there because there isn't much upside gain, you know, and there's a lot of downside risk. By contrast, you know, if you've got a brand like Old Spice, which is probably going to die in 4 years anyway, okay, then that's a case where your advertising should actually be, look, actually here, when we do this totally wacky ad campaign for Old Spice, we should be relatively content with the possibility of failure.
Yes.
But in fact, if you kill a dying brand off early, you're probably better off than you are, you know, keeping it on life support for 17 years anyway.
Well, indeed. But I guess it's like, maybe execs and leaders in larger organizations that are trying to be a bit more innovative or sort of feel like slightly they're more constrained by their by their environment. I guess what you're saying in the book is, and trying to almost like cultivate, is this idea about what it takes to be an alchemist, as it were.
Yeah,
where to look.
The very, very simple thing is the desire to be reasonable. And the desire to justify your actions imposes huge creative opportunity costs on what you actually subsequently experiment with.
Okay. So if I was to say to you, I mean, entrepreneurs, I think, feel like naturally either restless or dissatisfied with the current status quo because they have a Oh, by the way, a lot of them are really, really wrong. By the way, I mean we mustn't forget this. This is again a great Nassim Taleb lesson, which is that failure rate among restaurants is why restaurants are good. Because actually most new restaurants fail. And of course, the survivorship bias means we think that running a restaurant is really easy because the only restaurants we go to are the ones that are actually packed full of people enjoying a great meal. Yes.
Actually, most new restaurants fail.
Well, as do most kind of new businesses.
But no, and actually, you know, in a sense, their job is to fail because if you weren't failing, it's the old phrase, their job within the wider ecosystem is to fail.
Yes.
And the job of capitalism is actually to reward those businesses for being lucky. The people actually, some of the people who start brilliant entrepreneurial companies are actually stupid. And one of the reasons leftists tend to hate capitalism is because quite often capitalism has this facet where it rewards lucky idiots. But actually, if you think about it, for capitalism to work, it has to reward lucky idiots. Because if we refuse to allow discoveries that have been arrived at by luck, or indeed by the value of ignorance, which is that you don't know, that you actually don't know enough to actually follow the category norms which everybody else in your category believes are sacrosanct.
Sure.
Okay. So, I mean, stupidity actually has really valuable qualities to it because, you know, the stupid person who, my father always resents the fact that he studied law in Cambridge because he said the effect of studying in Cambridge is to make you think that everything's much more difficult than it really is. And he goes back home, his father dies, he has to move back to Monmouthshire. And he thought for a moment, maybe I should start an estate agency. And he thought, no, I can't possibly start an estate agency. You must require unbelievably complicated skills to be an estate agent. I mean, you know, I couldn't even begin without 4 years training to become an estate agent. And he said it was 50 years later where he discovered it's buy a shop and bang some photos in the window and hope. Okay,
it's like one of my favorite quotes. I think comes from Voltaire, and he says, "I think it's right in saying this is to be absolutely certain of something, one must know absolutely everything about it or nothing about it."
That is utterly fantastic. Yeah, which is, I suppose, it's the version of a little learning is a dangerous thing.
Yes, indeed.
Which is, that's absolutely fantastic. Funny enough, there's a planner at BBH, and I can't remember which one it is, who always said that the only people he's interested in talking to are really, really, really clever expert people or ordinary people, just average or even stupid people. Because he said that actually the half-educated are in some ways a bloody disaster. Because they have the confidence of that's born of enough knowledge to be confident.
Yes.
Unfortunately, they don't have the knowledge that's actually required to understand the whole equation of what's going on.
Yes.
Economics is a perfect example, actually, of a moron science, which gives you the confidence to think you understand things in theory while remaining totally ignorant of how the world works in practice.
So let me ask you about this. So you've got these people, particularly because I'm interested in service and experience. I mean, I don't consider myself an expert in any ways. Because I think those sort of terms belong to other people, and I'm more of an explorer and a student as more than anything else.
Yeah, I must admit, I've become a kind of, I agree with you, I've become what I describe myself as a marketing naturalist, not naturist. There's a great book, which he's speaking at Nudgestock on June the 6th, by the way. June the 7th, sorry.
I'll see you there.
June the 7th, you'll see me there. Folkestone, nudgestock.co.uk. And Robert H. Frank wrote a book called The Darwin Economy. He's written another book called The Economic Naturalist. Mm-hmm. It is the book, The Economic Naturalist, which was my Damascus Road experience in all of this.
Okay.
Without that book, without reading that book while I had flu, I'm not sure I would have, my whole life would have been different. Because it suddenly taught me that if you look at business through the eyes of a naturalist and you look at it as a complex, evolving system constantly reacting to change. Mm-hmm. And of course, the interesting thing about Darwin's theory is it's not a theory about how things are, it's a theory about how things change.
Yes.
Over time.
Yes.
So it's very different in that sense because it's not really predictive. Mm-hmm. It's explanatory, but it's not really predictive.
Yes.
And so the really interesting thing there is that once you take the view, as I think both of us do, which is marketing is like the Galapagos Islands of understanding human behavior,
yes.
All the little finches' beaks are there, short stubby beaks, long pointy beaks. They both work, but in a different kind of flower, all that sort of shit. Okay. Mm-hmm. Once you take that mindset, and I've ended up really becoming a kind of, Alfred Russel Wallace of consumer capitalism. And once you take, and I think you are as well, I think once you have that kind of viewpoint, it is enormously liberating because you're no longer constrained by the usual kind of, okay, we have to be absolutely certain about everything before we can proceed nonsense.
Yes, indeed.
You start going, look, actually, why don't we just take one thing we always assumed is true and just try the opposite?
Well, so yeah, I mean, I guess the kind of thing is that it seems to me that the trick is that the way that we're educated is almost to follow the rules. Or here's a path, or here's a process, sort of thing. And I guess ultimately, what we end up doing is almost like we lose the curiosity side of things, and almost the bravery side of things. And I guess in the book, that's what you're advocating is to say to be more curious, to be a bit braver, to be a bit more explorative.
I think what you have to do is you have to partition off. I'm conscious of the fact that I work with Ogilvy. I'm conscious of the fact that we work with very large established brands, although the behavioral change practice, behavioral science practice doesn't. We also work with smaller organizations because the great thing about behavioral science is the barrier to entry in terms of cost is pretty low.
Yes.
And I'd argue also, one of the problems about focusing on advertising and focusing on advertising first is you only talk to businesses that are already successful. Yes. And I think if the marketing services industry is to truly demonstrate its value, we need to go in, I think, far more .com, that's probably a very old-fashioned phrase, far more disruptive businesses fail because of bad marketing thinking than of bad intrinsic product design.
Right.
And so we need to be able to go in a scalable, fractal way and say, I know you've only got 10,000 quid, but we as Ogilvy can make some suggestions to you which might be decisive in the growth and survival of your company. Because you're assuming X, and actually your assumption might be the opposite of the truth.
Yes. And but I guess my question was, if people want to do this and also want to try, I mean, apart from reading the book and getting inspired by all sorts of different ideas and, being shown the way that sometimes the opposite is just as good as a current way of thinking. But people wanted to think. Also, the other thing around it is about how do people develop that sort of almost capability or that habit or that sort of mindset in your experience? I mean, because you'll have worked with people and brands that have gone from here to move over to this more of a curious, explorative sort of way of kind of being and thinking. And what's the best way to do that rather than just?
Yeah, I mean.
It's a bit self-help, I know this, but I'm asking.
No, it's not. You've got to be much more comfortable with ambiguity. You've got to look at it through the eyes of a naturalist or a biologist, not through the eyes of an engineer.
Right.
And so the models you've got to draw. I would argue the way to do this is actually probably to read books on. I would probably say that actually people who've studied evolutionary biology and although I'm not the world's biggest Dawkins fan, read The Selfish Gene, for goodness sake.
Mm-hmm.
Read those books which actually change your view. Taleb's done it, I think, with Anti-Fragile and also with Fooled by Randomness.
Yeah.
There was a very influential book, and I always feel sorry for not. Now, I've got to be very careful here because what the hell is his name? The evolutionary biologist who wrote Full House. Stephen Jay Gould, right. Now, the thing about Stephen Jay Gould is he's widely despised in evolutionary biological circles because he had some very weird ideas.
Right.
And he was wrong about quite a lot. But he did write a book called Life's Grandeur, which in the US is called Full House.
Right.
Which is another example of a book that actually looks completely differently at evolution. One of the points it makes is that actually, in sheer mass terms, plants and insects are much more successful than humans. Humans are actually a complete outlier in terms of because so his view is that the standard view of evolution, where humans are at the pinnacle, is a complete case of it's kind of geocentric, self-aggrandizing view of how evolution works.
Yes.
And that humans in many ways are a bit of an anomaly. And the interesting thing there, though, is that any of those books which basically go, I used to look at it like that. And so it's like buying a tube map which is actually geographically faithful, or it's like buying a tube map which also includes Thameslink, and the South London Rail Network. You suddenly go, oh, so it's not like that at all. It's actually like this.
Right.
Or maybe it's just that it enables you to realize the very simple fact that what a thing is does not determine how you perceive it. The context and framework in which you perceive something determines your understanding. And so once you understand that our view of the world is not context-free and that you can wiggle with context and actually, generally speaking, if you've got a problem, if you can look at the problem in a new way, you've probably solved the problem.
Yeah.
If you can also say the reason this problem is persistent was because we're assuming X, and actually the truth may be Y, which appears to us like X, but is actually Y, which I suppose is Nassim Taleb's Fooled by Randomness book, where you go, we would typically say that really, really clever supermarkets placed the chocolate by the till to maximize pester power, so that children would pester their parents into buying chocolate. Whereas an equally likely explanation, in fact, I would say a more likely explanation, is that some retailers just discovered that when the chocolate was next to the till, you sold a lot more chocolate. Other retailers copied this, because when you start a shop, the best practice is probably to copy the layout of successful existing shops. And therefore, it's possible that the chocolate is placed by the till in retailers, not through any act of actual human intent or cognition, but simply because shops that didn't do it didn't sell a lot of chocolate.
And that's like an evolutionary thing in many ways.
And so you're looking at it not through the eye that everything's designed. You're also realizing that survivorship bias imposes very, very strong effects on the world that we tend to interpret as intent. Now, I've often asked the question, I think that the ancient Greeks had a more intelligent view of the world than modern people do. Because the ancient Greeks, by having a system of gods where you said, the reason that happened is because Phoebus Apollo wanted it to happen, that takes the human urge to attach intent and conscious intentionality on random events, and it deifies it.
Yes.
The modern version of that might be you create a totally ridiculous conspiracy theory about how shops are all trying to put chocolate next to the till.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I'm interested in and I think you touched on this. I mean, the book's all about this because
my love of evolutionary biology is really because it's one of the great. If I were better at astrophysics, I might be really into special relativity for the same reason. But I'm too thick for that stuff, and also, I mean, actually, evolutionary biologists are great because they're actually quite interested in marketing, because evolutionary biologists understand advertising and signaling in a way that most people don't. Yeah. So the fact that, for example, maybe the value, someone who's very literal minded would look at the knowledge, which is what we force all London taxi drivers to go through, and say it is there to train people the roads around London, and therefore the invention of the sat-nav makes the knowledge redundant. Now, someone who understood signaling and commitment devices would say maybe it's worth putting taxi drivers through a grueling process, so that the only people who become taxi drivers are committed to driving taxis.
Of course.
In other words, they're not doing it in their spare time just to raise a few bob as a holiday job.
Yeah, well, it devalues the profession.
And B, of course, it imposes huge costs on anybody who gets kicked out, who loses their badge. So the taxi driver becomes highly trustworthy because of the fact that you'd have to... Now, there was the great exception, of course, of the taxi cab rapist. But what's significant about him is how rare he is, not how common he is.
Sure.
Compared to minicab assaults, black cab assaults are vanishingly rare. And one of the reasons is that if you've spent 4 years of your life acquiring this badge, you're not going to throw it away by making pervy comments to a female passenger, or by, for example, taking an American tourist on a sort of 2-mile detour to take them to Hampstead or whatever.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing that I took away from the book, I mean, it's just this idea that, like you said before, like change your perspective, or be clear on the outcomes that you want to achieve, but actually also be even clearer that actually there are very, very many ways of achieving the same.
And many of them are a very good book, by the way, which is also about this, is Obliquity by John Kay.
Yes. Which has been around for...
Which has been around for about 10 or 12 years now, I think.
Yeah, no, John Kay, I love John Kay. He's...
right, yeah. He's right about everything. Yeah, extraordinary. Yeah, really incredible.
I mean, I think the thing is, so I would say, given that I talk about sort of service and experience, I mean, I think there are examples out there of companies that just turn the convention on its head, like from everything from, like, examples I love, there's a company called Gravity Payments in Seattle that was inspired by a Daniel Kahneman paper about the sort of the amount of income that you have to pay somebody before you end up getting to diminishing marginal returns as a contribution to happiness. And they figured out it was about 70,000, 75,000.
That's right, yes, yeah.
Well, this guy, Dan Price, who's the CEO of Gravity Payments, just kind of went in and said, right, we're going the minimum salary we're going to pay everybody is going to be $70,000. And there's all sorts of people that were throwing their toys out of the pram because it went against sort of what they thought was capitalist mechanics of running organizations, as it were. And it was a socialist revolution. But in actual fact, all the metrics went in the right way.
There are only two places, if you want to be in business and you want to practice what I'd call this kind of Alan Kay skill of flipping the perspective. There are only two places in business to be. One of them is, I would argue, in entrepreneurialism. The other one is to be in marketing, which is the only discipline which has any chance of injecting this kind of thinking into larger organizations.
Yeah.
Because McKinsey ain't going to do it, okay?
No.
You know, none of those consulting firms are going to do it. Your accountant isn't going to do it. Your finance director's not going to do it. He's deeply wedded to an existing model. It's only the marketing brigade, who already bring a contrarian model, of course, because they look at problems over time through a consumer's eyes, not in aggregate on a balance sheet, in snapshots.
Yes.
So it's only the market who has the longitudinal view. It's only the market who has the customer's eye view. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, I would take marketing further and say the wider job of marketing is to bring completely contrarian perspectives to the understanding of business.
And I would build on that even further and say that, given some of the recent research statistics that are coming out and the reports about much of the underperforming and blandness of many of the experience initiatives that are getting rolled out by kind of major organizations and brands, that there is huge opportunity for doing something which is slightly kind of more contrarian. And I think there's an appetite in the market I think in business and also in the market to do something that stands out and to be slightly different. And so the table is set, ladies and gentlemen.
And actually, the appetite in marketing, I think, is that I think behavioral science is a very, I would include in it evolutionary psychology. I'd include complexity economics. What I call my sort of the academic fields on which I draw for inspiration would include everything from really, really good understanding of data and statistics.
Yeah.
Really good understanding of complex systems, really good understanding of evolutionary psychology, really good understanding of behavioral economics, and a really good facility for essentially going, okay, if we hand this strange Gordian knot to McKinsey, all of them will approach it in exactly the same way. Mm-hmm. It's a unique characteristic of the entrepreneur or the marketer. And of course, the greatest entrepreneurs are also great marketers, either accidentally or on purpose, Jobs being the most extreme case, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But it's only these people who are going to come in and go, yes, look, this looks like an absolutely impossible Gordian knot. However, if you twist it around by 90 degrees and look at it this way, your solution suddenly becomes an order of magnitude simpler.
Sure. Absolutely. So, Rory, I'm going to say I love the book because I think it feels like a journal in many ways, and a bit of a personal kind of journey that's been pulled together over some time. I think some of the stories are great. Is there anything?
What don't you like about the book?
What don't I like about the book? Well, I think the thing I like the most about the book is what's on the spine.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Now, I'm not exactly sure, which says, ladies, for people
that may only be actually for the publicity edition, but benign bullshit.
So I'm lucky enough to have an uncorrected proof copy, and on the spine it says the book's called Alchemy, but on the spine it says benign bullshit, which I thought was just genius, and I'm rather hoping it survives into the actual kind of print copy. But the thing, what do I not like it? Well, I guess because I haven't seen the final kind of the final copy.
By the way, there are a few paragraphs in that uncorrected proof edition which are gobbledygook. Yeah. Where there's been some sort of not too many, fortunately, but those are all corrected now. At least I hope so.
Yeah, no, I think because when you get the uncorrected copy,
you accept that they're going to be
all the notes and everything else. But actually, you know what? Here's the thing. There's I'm a little bit wary about books that are of that sort of size.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah,
I'm always kind of a little bit going, I'm sure you could have written me a shorter book. But actually, I wasn't disappointed because...
the answer to that is very simple, which is we split it into very short chapters, read it on the toilet, put it on the toilet.
So it's not something that you necessarily... You can pick up and put down and you can read different...
In some ways, writing the book made me an enemy of too much structure.
Yes.
Because actually, do you know why the reason books are so sodding big, by the way? It's because it's entirely a product of the paper book trade, which is that you can't charge $15.99 for a 45-page book.
Well, no, I actually I disagree with that. The industry believes that you can't charge...
Well, yes, sorry, you're absolutely right there. Having said that, there are some really weird things in publishing. Short stories, which any logical person would predict would be a boom industry because we've all got shorter attention spans, supposedly. There are lots of people like commuters who you'd think would love collections of short stories, but apparently they're kind of like publishing suicide. Poetry, of course, is difficult to sell because the books tend to be very thin. There is some evidence, of course, that books are bought as presents.
Yes.
And therefore, in order for a book to feel like a present, it has to be at least 3/4 of an inch thick. I don't disagree with you. What I'd like to say is you can actually read the book by just reading the footnotes. You can keep it in your toilet. and you can just read it one chapter at a time, or you can dip into it at random, and the whole thing will still deliver some sort of value. It's not one of those things where if you miss the argument on page 27, the rest of the book's going to be incomprehensible.
I think that's absolutely right. And and as I say, it's like you can also with a gold cover book, you can actually you can read it on the train, and it will just attract attention in and of itself.
I hope so. Yeah, and the other thinking of the thing is, I hope it. Yeah, what I think I'm saying is really that we're the need to be rational is painting everything from business to government policy making into a corner where it's unable to escape because of its requirement that everything must be rational before it's even tested.
Yes.
And if you look at the scientific method, notionally the scientific method's about hypothesis testing.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, to be absolutely honest, you could more accurately say it's guess testing, as Richard Feynman says.
Yes.
I go a bit further still and also say that it's about, it's actually about lucky accidents.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great guy called Paul Feyerabend who must have had the world's most interesting life because he got as an Austrian, he was awarded the Iron Cross for fighting the Ivans on the Eastern Front, and then ended up in the philosophy faculty of Berkeley University in the 1960s. So, you know, life, it's all about contrasts. And the interesting thing there is that he's actually what he calls a methodological anarchist.
Right.
But actually, if you look at the history of scientific discovery and if you look at the history of business disruption, it's a whole bunch of different stories.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that there's one methodology we should become particularly, if you're a really principled scientist, you should refuse to use penicillin because it was discovered by accident. By a guy, by the way, I hate to say this because, his observation probably saved more people than, virtually anybody else. Jenner would have been another, I guess. Okay, in terms of saving lives, there's, those 5 or 6 medical magic bullets are extraordinary. But actually, I have heard talk that he was actually he wasn't all that bright. He just had one moment of observation.
But then again, that goes back to what you said earlier on, where you talked sometimes the system rewards idiots, lucky idiots.
Yeah, and actually any good system, this is, again, communism could never come up with Red Bull, could it? I mean, you never sit down and go, well, we've decided for our next 5-year plan that what the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics really needs is an overpriced, disgusting tasting drink.
Yeah.
But equally, okay, it would never come up with, for example, I don't think it would have come up with, of course, the computer or the internet, simply because, because I think I knew a bit about behavioral science. I was an instant internet convert because I realized that actually relatively trivial differences in the interface have an enormous effect on human behavior. Yeah. But most economists would go, the interface is actually totally secondary to determining behavior. The economists looked at this from an informational standpoint, not from a transactional one.
Well, it's also, yes, completely kind of, but if you look at it from a utility perspective, which is the bedrock of rational kind of like thinking, rational economic sort of thinking, then everything would be very boring, and it would all be beige.
It would all be beige, yeah. And actually, of course, one of the most interesting questions asked, we always forget this because we talk about the iPhone and we talk about the iPod, but the iMac was effectively someone going, I want to produce a computer that makes you want to lick it. Okay. Now, I'm fairly confident that no one at HP would have kept their job if they'd walked into a room and presented that sentence. It was the iMac that rescued Apple, actually, I think.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But I guess it's like, they're in a world which is awash with data and is awash with analytics and almost like, searching for the answer and almost like reductive kind of thinking. I guess what you're advocating is that actually if we want to make a difference, if we want to stand out, if we want to do something that really kind of shifts, then sometimes we have to look in the most illogical of places, and that might be kind of almost the underside or the opposite, or in a completely different direction.
By the way, before I finish, I ought to advance another theory. One theory is that reading John Kay's Obliquity, Anti-Fragile, reading Fooled by Randomness, reading The Selfish Gene, reading on special relativity, all of those things which show how actually our model of the world is conditioned heavily by the frame of reference in which we perceive something.
Yes.
Okay? There's heavy domain dependence.
Of course.
And I've noticed this thing that video conferencing, which I'm a total evangelist for, I think video conferencing holds the potential to increase business productivity by 20%. Okay? Maybe more. Okay. The reason everybody sends emails is that we don't realize how slow they are, because while we're typing an email, it feels fast.
Sure.
Qua an email. Okay. Now, interestingly, when you go on a boat at 40 miles an hour, you stand on the foredeck and go, whee! Because 40 miles an hour on water feels fast.
Yes.
Nobody does that in a car, except Labradors, okay? because actually 40 miles an hour to us just feels rather slow when you're in a car, whereas 40 miles an hour on a boat feels fantastic. Going tappity, 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 tap feels fast when I'm sending an email. If I had spoken to you throughout this podcast at the speed at which people type, the podcast would be unlistenable to unless you multiplied the speed by 3, in which case I'd sound like Alvin and the Chipmunks.
Indeed.
Right?
But that's also what's underlining kind of the success of intelligent voice assistants.
Yep.
It's it's faster and easier to speak than it is to type.
And of course, there will be a point at which they haven't yet hit it. I still find Alexa mildly annoying, and that's one of the better examples of it. I'm going to make a secondary theory, which is just another way of looking at it. So what I've said is that marketers are particularly good at this. Marketers are the only people other than entrepreneurs who actually bring this to business, which is actually the reason this problem is wrong is not because is patently one. Okay, if a problem remains a problem, then let's be honest, if there were a logical answer to the problem, we already would have found it.
Sure.
Because there's no shortage of flaming logical economists, finance directors, procurement officers, McKinseyites in every organization, so that if the problem could be solved logically, by a logical solution, someone would have found it. Therefore, the likelihood is that persistent problems have acquired immunity to logic.
Sure.
So that's one thought. Okay, so at some point you've got to be non-logical or psychological, perhaps, in order to solve this problem. Okay, now here's the other possibility. Either marketers and people who've read The Selfish Gene and people who've read actually good behavioral economics books have learned to the extent to which perspective and context determines thinking and behavior, thinking, feeling, and behavior. And that's a really important insight. In other words, that actually what we do is not a product of what is, it's a product of the meaning of what is. And the meaning of what is highly determined by other things other than what is.
Yes.
Okay. So the mapping of reality onto behavior, is messy. Now, I've got another possible theory, which is that it's not that actually everybody finds it really difficult to think of business except in a kind of mechanistic economist view. It's that actually things like the shareholder value movement, that things like the efficient market hypothesis, okay, that actually deep down in reality, or for example, things like Marxism, okay, that deep down in reality, nobody ever really believed them. But they thought that everybody else believed them, so it became much, much easier to pretend that you did. I'm saying that because I think it's a good point to end. Unfortunately, I've got to go and sort some things out at 12:30.
No,
so
absolutely.
It's a good way to end. But it strikes me as a perfectly possible hypothesis that actually chief executives think that the shareholder value movement is bollocks. And that investors think that the shareholder value movement is bollocks. But because both of them thinks the other believes it, everyone is forced to proceed as though it were true.
And that is the elephant in the room. And on that note, I would just say, well, maybe that's a conspiracy theory that we should start right here, Rory.
I think we should start it right here because I don't think any. And I occasionally get people coming up to me who said, you know what? They said, a guy who's head of a huge travel company. He said, You know what? He said, I've never believed any of that economic bollocks either. He said, I don't even believe that if you drop the price, demand goes up. And he said, the miracle is that I've managed to make it to CEO while not believing any of this stuff.
And on that note, all I'm going to say is well done for writing the book.
Can I say what a fantastic interview this has been? I'll see you at Nudgestock, and I will. The other thing is, if we can work together in any shape through the miracle of video conferencing or through the miracle of Thameslink, because of course we're right next to Blackfriars. So if you live in Brighton, penetrating rail services are 5 times more important than terminus rail services.
Absolutely,
but that's for another podcast. I just like to say how much I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's been fantastic.
Rory, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, I will make sure that I will plug Nudgestock, which is the festival that you organise and curate coming up in June, and also kind of Alchemy, which is your new book, Alchemy. Rory Sutherland, you find it all at major bookstores. Amazon, you can find it. It's there. It's got a nice gold cover. I just want to say, brilliant. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
It's been a joy. A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for another interview. I really hope you enjoyed it. Now, every time I complete one of these interviews, I learn something new. And I try and incorporate that new learning into my writing, my speaking, my workshops, and the consulting that I do for my clients. If you're interested, you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinsko.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do listen in again. All the very best.